best offensive performances of 2024. Number three, the third best offensive performance of the season, I believe, goes to the Baylor game at home. We saw the whiteout, and it was a fabulous night in general for Iowa State football. But this was a game that you had a Baylor team that was at the time struggling a little bit coming in, but turned out, by the end of the season, Baylor was a really, really nice football team. And, this was a game that Iowa State pretty much dominated from start to finish. Baylor's quarterback did a nice job escaping around the pocket and creating plays on the run. It was a game where you had all this big atmosphere at Iowa State, and they came out, they did a great job against a Baylor defense that turned out to be pretty good by the end of the season. Final game was 43-21. You come out here, you put up 43 points against a good Baylor team. You have some really, really nice performances. Rocco goes 16-25, 277 yards for 2 touchdowns and a pick. This was actually a big breakout game running back in the running game, actually, for Iowa State. Jalen Jackson kind of has his best performance as a Cyclone, really. 15 carries, 111 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Carson Hansen puts in another 98 yards on 15 carries. And, Jaden Higgins has 8 receptions for 116 yards and a touchdown. Jalen Noel almost hits that 100-yard mark when he has 98 yards on 5 catches. A complete all-around performance. You only turned the ball over one time. It was a solid Baylor defense, not world-stopping, but a very solid Baylor defense that by the end of the season was very good. And you had Rocco being his normal efficient self. The run game was great. Nice balanced performance by all these. It's one of those games you look back on as this was just a complete dominant performance by Iowa State on both sides of the ball. It was one of Rocco's better games of the season. He didn't have to do a lot necessarily. He didn't have to ask him to do a lot, but Rocco, especially early on in the season, did a really nice job being really efficient, using the legs when he needed to. That was your first ever experience attending an Iowa State game. I'm not sure you could have ever experienced a better showcase of the football program, of the university, of the fan base, everything. It was darn near a perfect night of football. My second best offensive performance from the season is going to go to the Utah game. You get a nice performance there from Rocco, 20 of 38, 256 for a touchdown and interception. That's not a super high completion percentage, but he was making good throws. And frankly, this game ended up closer than it should have been. Utah, after Luke Wilson goes down, the running game is just okay against Utah. Only 135 yards. Carson Hansen punches in a couple. Rocco does what he needs to do in the running game. But you get a nice game from Jaden Higgins here, 9 receptions for 155 yards. This isn't a game that you're looking at as like, this wasn't an offensive explosion necessarily, but Utah was for as bad as their offense was, their defense was still very, very good this season. You're going on the road. First time you're playing at Rice-Eccles Stadium. This is a game where you needed to come in and take care of business because even though Utah had been really, really struggling during the season up to this point, that defense was still lights out. And this was a game where you could have sleptwalk into Salt Lake and, had a rough game, turned the ball over a couple times, and then let their skill position players do some damage. But they did a good job taking care of the ball. Rocco did throw a pick, but other than that, they took care of the ball. They took care of business. It was a game that was never as close as the final score indicated. That finished out that the game finished out as 31-28. It finished out as a 3-point game. It was a good win for Iowa State. And I think it's a really nice offensive performance to be able to go in there and to not necessarily play your best. They got the job done when they needed to against a very, very good defense on the road in a tough environment. So I was really impressed with that Utah game. I just thought it was a nice win, even if Utah was struggling a bit this season. So my number one offensive performance of the season is going to go to the Miami game in the Pop-Tart Bowl. The Iowa State offense looked nigh unstoppable. This was not a Miami. This is not a game where Miami's defense had a shot at stopping Iowa State. Iowa State moved the ball and did whatever it wanted to the entire game. Miami had no offense, no answer for anything. Rocco goes 22 of 36, 270 yards and 3 touchdowns. Perfect, as far as touchdown to interception ratio, doesn't throw a pick, has just a great game. Carson Hansen, you don't see a lot of yards here necessarily, but Carson Hansen has a couple really nice runs. He had that 30-yard run there too. He did a nice job moving the chains, getting down the end zone, had a couple touchdowns of his own. The receiving game, you had Jalen Noel getting a $117 there. He had just a great final game of his career. Maybe I should say, when I say best offensive performances, is it necessarily the most yards or the most points or the most efficient? Not necessarily, but I think when you're looking at the circumstances, I think these are the ones that stick out to me as just like my favorite offensive performances or maybe the most impactful. So those are my favorite 3 offensive performances. So now I want to move on to my defensive performances of the season. Number 3 on this list was Texas Tech. This game, I understand, was one of the 2 games that Iowa State lost in the regular season. Texas Tech at the time was the best offense in the Big 12 statistically, and one of the best in the country as far as pure efficiency, their yardage, their scoring, and all that. This was, Texas Tech came in with one of the most potent offenses in the country. They held them to 129 yards, which is a really nice job considering the defense had struggled up to that. The defense was just starting to struggle on the run game a little bit because their rushing yard, because the injuries to the linebackers were really starting to catch up to them. And they held them to 237 yards passing, 21 of 42 with a couple interceptions. That is a good defensive performance against a team like Texas Tech that really has good balance with Taj Brooks and that passing game, but they can air it out and they can be very vertical when they want to be. They could be explosive when they wanted to be. So, holding them to 23 points and really outside of that, they're the last drive of the game to get them to 23. I mean, they were at 16 for a lot of that game, so holding Texas Tech that far down, I think that's a nice job from that defense. Second best defensive performance on the season is going to go to West Virginia. You go to West Virginia, they are feeling all right up to this point. I mean, they were 3-3 going into this, but they played a few teams really close, and they were kind of a wacky little team. They can do something and move the ball down the field pretty well. Garrett Green's kind of a really kind of a freak athlete at the quarterback position. Not like a great throw of the football, but he is an unbelievable runner, and he just makes plays. But you go in there, you pick off Garrett Green a couple times. He doesn't really do much. He has a nice game running the ball, but you turn him over a couple different times. Rocco's efficient, 18 to 26, 265 for a touchdown. That's about as good as you're going to get, from a college quarterback. Maybe you get one more touchdown there, but that's about it. Jaden Higgins, 6 receptions for 102. Jalen has the touchdown, 5 receptions for 77. Of course, most of that comes on a 60-yard bomb there. Carson Hansen has kind of probably his first breakout game, I would say really even as a Cyclone. 20 carries, 97 yards, 3 touchdowns. Huge game for Carson Hansen. This is probably the game I think he really started to establish himself as the lead back. You see there, Abu Sam only got 2 carries. Jalen Jackson got 12 because I believe that would have been right. That was right after the Baylor game. When Jalen Jackson had his big game. So they were trying to, lean on Jalen Jackson a little bit more, but he obviously very much struggled. But Carson Hansen had a great game. Rocco was awesome. But you look at holding back West Virginia, that's an offense that have been putting up. They've got some good running backs. CJ Donaldson and Jaheim White are both very, very good running backs. And you held them to almost nothing. Like I said, even at this point, your injuries are starting to pile up just a little bit. This is a great defensive performance from Iowa State, especially in a tough environment where you could have let something get away from you, but you didn't. And that was a great job. Number 1 defensive performance of this season, though, goes to 43-21 win over Baylor. Baylor's really kind of struggling to move the ball quite a bit. They just can't run the ball at all. Look at that, 79 yards on 20 attempts. They're not trying to run it a ton, but Baylor's typically a team that runs the ball fairly well. Sawyer Robertson is a great quarterback. I think he's going to be really, really nice going forward. He individually had a great game. Outside of Sawyer Robertson making a couple miracle plays, the Baylor offense just couldn't get much of anything going consistently. They didn't really connect on anything big. They had a 30-yard completion there, but for the most part, they were just kind of having to nickel and dime their way up the field, which is exactly how Iowa State wants to win these games. And holding that rushing attack down is a really nice sign there. I've got Texas Tech at 3, West Virginia at 2, Baylor at 1 for my best defensive games of the season for Iowa State football.